The Atlantic had no mercy left to give. Captain Elias Thorne stood at the helm of the Morning Tide, his calloused hands gripping the wheel as though it were the only thread binding him to this world. The ship groaned beneath him, her timbers swollen with salt and rot, her sails patched so many times they resembled the tattered flags of forgotten kingdoms. Around him, the crew moved like ghosts, thin, hollow-eyed men who had stopped singing weeks ago, who no longer gambled or fought, who simply existed in the slow countdown toward death. It was late October, and the sky over the Carolina coast had turned the color of old bruises. Storm clouds gathered on the horizon, thick and churning, but they brought no rain, only wind that tasted of iron and ash. The ocean itself seemed to hold its breath, its surface unnaturally still, as if waiting for something to break. Elias had sailed these waters for 40 years, had weathered hurricanes that tore masts from their roots and waves that swallowed entire crews whole, but he had never felt the sea like this, watchful, patient, hungry. His first mate, a grizzled Irishman named Rowan, approached slowly, his boots scraping against the deck. His face was gaunt, his beard matted with dried sweat and brine. "Captain," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "we've searched every barrel, every crate, every corner of the hold. There's nothing left." Elias didn't answer immediately. He stared out at the endless gray water, at the fog that had followed them for days like a living thing, curling around the ship's hull, muffling sound, swallowing light. They had been drifting for 3 weeks since the last storm destroyed their provisions and scattered the convoy they had been traveling with. No land in sight, no birds in the sky, just silence and hunger and the slow erasure of hope. "Nothing?" Elias finally asked, though he already knew the answer. Rowan hesitated, then reached into his coat and pulled out a small cloth bundle. He unwrapped it carefully as if it were made of glass. Inside was a single ship's biscuit, hard as stone, the size of a man's palm, covered in mold along one edge. It was the kind of thing they used to feed to prisoners, to slaves, to men who had nothing left to lose. And now it was all they had. "Found it wedged behind the cook's chest," Rowan said quietly. "Must have rolled there during the storm." Elias took the biscuit in his hands and felt its weight. So small, so meaningless, and yet it might buy another day, maybe 2, for one man. He looked around the deck. 37 souls remained. 37 men who had followed him into the jaws of hell and back, who had trusted him when trust was a currency more valuable than gold. Some lay slumped against the railings, too weak to stand. Others stared out at the fog with empty eyes, already halfway to wherever dead sailors go. And then he saw the boy. Finn was crouched near the mainmast, his knees pulled to his chest, his arms wrapped around his ribs as if trying to hold himself together. He couldn't have been more than 14, though the sea had a way of aging boys fast. His hair was the color of straw, his skin pale and freckled, his eyes, those damned eyes, so wide and blue they looked like pieces of the sky that had fallen into his face and gotten stuck there. He had signed on in Charleston 6 months ago, desperate for work after his father died in a mill fire. Elias had hesitated, had nearly turned him away, but the boy had stood there on the dock with his chin raised and his fists clenched and said, "I'm stronger than I look, sir, and I learn fast." He had been right. Finn had worked harder than men twice his age, had climbed the rigging in lightning storms, had never complained, never wept, never asked for more than his share, and now he was dying. They all were. But the boy, God, the boy reminded him of his own sons, the ones he had lost to fever and war, the ones whose faces he could barely remember anymore, but whose absence carved a hole in his chest that never healed. Elias walked across the deck, his boots echoing in the silence. The crew watched him, their faces expressionless, too exhausted for hope or envy. He knelt beside Finn, and the boy looked up at him with those ocean eyes, and Elias saw something there that broke him. Not fear, not desperation, but resignation. The boy had already accepted that he was going to die. "Here," Elias said, pressing the biscuit into Finn's hands. "Eat." Finn stared at it, then at the captain, his lips trembling. "But sir—" "Eat," Elias repeated, his voice soft but unyielding. "That's an order." The boy's hand shook as he brought the biscuit to his mouth. He bit into it, the sound of cracking crust loud in the stillness, and chewed slowly, tears streaming down his hollow cheeks. The crew watched in silence. No one protested. No one moved. They understood in that moment what Elias had done, not just given food to a boy, but reminded them all that they were still human, still capable of something other than survival. Rowan stood beside the captain, his jaw tight. "You should have taken it yourself." Elias shook his head. "I've lived long enough." That night, as the fog thickened and the stars disappeared, Elias lay in his cabin and listened to the ship creak and sway. He thought about his life, the battles fought, the treasures stolen, the men killed, the mistakes made. He had been called a pirate, a privateer, a monster, a hero, depending on who was telling the story. But in the end, none of it mattered. He was just a tired old man on a dying ship, waiting for the ocean to claim what it was owed. He closed his eyes and whispered a prayer his mother had taught him as a child, a prayer for sailors lost at sea, for souls wandering in darkness, for mercy where none was deserved. And then he waited for the end. Chapter 2. The Dawn Salute. The scream came with the first light. Elias jolted awake, his heart hammering against his ribs, his hand instinctively reaching for the pistol he kept beneath his pillow. For a moment he couldn't remember where he was. The cabin was dark, the air thick with the smell of mildew and old wood, and his body ached in ways that made him feel every one of his 63 years. Then the ship rocked gently beneath him, and memory returned like a cold wave. The morning tide, the starvation, the biscuit, the boy. He had expected to die in his sleep. Part of him had wanted to, but the scream, high-pitched, ragged with emotion, pulled him back into the world of the living whether he liked it or not. He threw off the thin blanket and stumbled to his feet, his legs unsteady, his vision swimming. Through the small porthole window he could see light. Pale gray, the color of dawn filtered through fog. He grabbed his coat and pushed through the cabin door, emerging onto the deck where the crew had gathered at the starboard railing. Their faces turned toward the sea, their mouths open, their eyes wide with something that looked like terror and wonder mixed together in equal measure. "What is it?" Elias demanded, his voice hoarse. "What's happened?" Rowan stood at the bow, one hand gripping the railing so hard his knuckles had gone white. He didn't turn around. He just pointed. Elias moved forward, pushing through the crowd of men who parted for him without a word. And when he reached the edge of the deck and looked out at what lay beyond, his breath caught in his throat and refused to come back. The fog had lifted, and in its place was an armada. Ships, hundreds of them, stretching across the horizon in every direction, their hulls rising from the water like the bones of some ancient leviathan, their masts tall and skeletal against the colorless sky. They were not like any vessels Elias had ever seen, not merchant ships, not warships, not fishing boats. They were wrong. Their wood was blackened and cracked, their sails hung in tatters that moved without wind, and along their decks stood figures, hundreds, thousands of figures, pale and translucent, their faces obscured by shadow, their forms flickering like candlelight. Ghost ships. Elias had heard the stories, of course. Every sailor had. Tales told in taverns and whispered on night watches. Stories of phantom fleets that appeared in storms or fog, of dead crews cursed to sail forever, of vessels that had been swallowed by the sea and refused to stay down. He had always dismissed them as superstition, the kind of nonsense that scared young sailors and made old ones rich selling rum-soaked lies. But this was real. The ships were arranged in perfect formation, two long columns stretching north and south with the morning tide positioned directly between them, as if she were being escorted or honored or judged. And as Elias watched, paralyzed by disbelief, the spectral crews began to move. On every ship the figures raised their arms in unison, and flags, tattered, translucent, glowing faintly with a light that seemed to come from within, rose slowly up the masts. They were not flags of nations or navies. They were blank, colorless, but their meaning was unmistakable. A salute. The ghost fleet was saluting the morning tide. Behind Elias, someone sobbed, a raw, broken sound. Another man fell to his knees and began to pray in Spanish, his voice shaking. Finn stood near the mainmast, his thin body trembling, the biscuit crumbs still on his lips, his eyes fixed on the impossible sight before them. Rowan just stared, his face drained of color, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "Captain," he whispered. What is this?" Elias didn't answer. He couldn't. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. trying to apply logic and reason to something that defied both. The ships were too many, too perfectly arranged, too impossibly present. This wasn't a dream. This wasn't madness. This was something else. Something older than maps and compasses. Something that belonged to the ocean itself, to the dark places where light never reached, and the laws of the living world no longer applied. And then, slowly, understanding began to dawn. The prayer, the biscuit, the boy. Elias turned and looked at Finn, who was still staring at the ghost ships with tears streaming down his face, and he remembered the weight of the biscuit in his hands, the choice he had made, the moment when he had given away the last thing he had to someone who needed it more. He had expected nothing in return. He had done it because it was right, because in that moment he had wanted to be something other than what he had always been. A man who took, who killed, who survived at the expense of others. One act of mercy. That was all it had been. But the ocean had been watching. The ghost ships held their salute for what felt like an eternity, their flags raised, their crews standing motionless in the pale dawn light. And then, as if responding to some silent command, they began to move. Not toward the morning tide, but away from her, their hulls turning in perfect synchronization, their sails filling with a wind that Elias could not feel. They moved slowly, gracefully, like dancers in a dream, and as they passed, each ship dipped its flag, once, twice, 3 times, before fading back into the mist from which it had come. One by one, they disappeared. The last ship lingered for a moment longer than the rest. It was smaller than the others, a sloop with a single mast and a figurehead carved in the shape of a woman reaching toward the sky. On its deck stood a lone figure, a man, tall and broad-shouldered, his face hidden beneath the shadow of a tricorn hat. He raised one hand toward Elias, not in threat but in acknowledgement, and then he too was gone, swallowed by the fog, leaving only the gray water and the silent sky. The crew of the morning tide stood frozen, too stunned to speak, too afraid to move. The ocean lapped gently against the hull, and somewhere in the distance, a gull cried, the first sound of life they had heard in weeks. Elias sank to his knees on the deck, his body shaking, his hands pressed against the worn planks. He didn't know if he was crying or laughing or simply breaking apart. All he knew was that something had changed, something fundamental, something irreversible. The ocean had answered, the dead had spoken, and for reasons he could not begin to understand, they had honored him. Rowan knelt beside him, his hand on the captain's shoulder. What do we do now? Elias looked up at the sky, at the pale light breaking through the clouds, and for the first time in weeks he felt something other than despair. We sail home, he said quietly, and we live. The wind returned that afternoon. It came from the south, warm and steady, filling the tattered sails of the morning tide with a strength they hadn't felt in months. The ship lurched forward, her timbers groaning with something that sounded almost like relief, and for the first time since the storm had scattered them across the Atlantic, they were moving with purpose rather than simply drifting toward oblivion. But it wasn't just the wind that had changed. Within hours of the Ghost Fleet's departure, a school of mackerel appeared alongside the ship. Dozens of them, their silver bodies flashing beneath the surface, practically throwing themselves at the hooks the crew lowered over the side. The men hauled them in with shaking hands, staring at the fish as if they were made of gold, unable to believe their sudden fortune. By evening, the deck smelled of smoke and cooking flesh, and for the first time in 3 weeks the crew of the morning tide ate until their bellies were full. Elias stood at the helm and watched his men come back to life. Color returned to their faces. Strength returned to their limbs. They laughed, tentatively at first, then louder, the sound strange and rusty after so much silence. They told jokes, shared stories, clapped each other on the back with a joy that bordered on hysteria. They were survivors. They had stared into the mouth of death and been spared, and now they celebrated with the desperation of men who knew how close they had come to never celebrating anything again. But beneath the relief, there was something else, a tension, an unease that rippled through the crew like a current beneath calm water. They kept glancing at Elias when they thought he wasn't looking, their eyes filled with questions they didn't dare ask aloud. What had happened out there in the fog? Why had the ghost ships come? What did it mean that the dead had saluted their captain, had honored him in a way that legends were made of? Rowan approached him as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of copper and blood. The Irishman's face was serious, his jaw set, and Elias knew before he spoke that this conversation had been inevitable. "The men are talking," Rowan said quietly, standing beside the captain and looking out at the darkening horizon. "They're scared, Elias. Not of dying anymore, of what saved us." Elias nodded slowly. He had expected this. Fear was easier to manage than gratitude when gratitude came wrapped in the supernatural. When salvation arrived in the form of ships that shouldn't exist, crewed by men who shouldn't be walking. "What are they saying?" Elias asked. Rowan hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Some think it was divine intervention, that God saw what you did for the boy and decided we were worth saving. Others think it was something darker, that you made a deal with the devil, or the sea itself, and that there'll be a price to pay." He paused, then added, "And a few think you've been touched by death, that you're marked now, that bad luck will follow us wherever we go." Elias smiled grimly. "And what do you think?" Rowan was quiet for a long moment, his weathered face unreadable. "I think," he said finally, "that I've sailed with you for 20 years, and I've seen you do terrible things and noble things, and most of the time things that were somewhere in between. I think you gave that boy your last meal because you couldn't live with yourself if you didn't, and I think whatever those ships were, they saw something in you that was worth honoring." He met Elias's eyes. "But I also think the ocean doesn't give gifts for free. So yeah, I'm worried about what comes next." Before Elias could respond, a shout came from the crow's nest. Young Finn, who had insisted on taking watch despite his weakened state, his voice cracking with excitement. "Land! Land ho! Off the port bow!" The crew erupted in cheers, rushing to the railing to catch a glimpse of the dark smudge on the horizon that marked the Carolina coast. They were saved. Truly, completely saved. Within 2 days, they would make port in Charleston, would feel solid ground beneath their feet, would return to the world of the living with a story that no one would believe but everyone would repeat. That night, as the ship sailed toward home beneath a sky full of stars, Elias made his way down to where Finn sat on a coil of rope near the bow, staring out at the moonlit water. The boy looked up as the captain approached, and there was something different in his eyes now. Not just gratitude, but a kind of reverence that made Elias deeply uncomfortable. "Can't sleep?" Elias asked, settling down beside him with a grunt. Finn shook his head. "Every time I close my eyes, I see them. The ships, the people on them." He swallowed hard. "Were they real, Captain, or are we all going mad?" Elias was quiet for a moment, watching the way the moonlight danced across the waves. "They were real," he said finally. "As real as you and me, just somewhere else. Somewhere between." "Why did they come?" Finn whispered. "Why did they salute us?" Elias looked at the boy, this child who had nearly died, who had been saved by nothing more than a moldy biscuit and an old man's guilt, and he felt the weight of something he couldn't name pressing down on his chest. "I don't know," he admitted. "Maybe because we needed them to. Maybe because someone, somewhere, decided we deserved a second chance." He paused, then added, "Or maybe because kindness is rare enough out here that even the dead take notice." Finn nodded slowly, processing this, and then he did something unexpected. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small piece of the biscuit, carefully wrapped in cloth. He had saved it, Elias realized, kept it like a relic, like proof that what had happened was real. "Thank you, Captain," Finn said softly, "for choosing me, for letting me live." Elias felt his throat tighten. He wanted to tell the boy that it was nothing, that anyone would have done the same, but he knew that wasn't true. Out here on the edge of survival, men became animals. They forgot who they were. They forgot what they were supposed to be. And yet somehow, in that moment when it mattered most, Elias had remembered. "You remind me of my sons," Elias said quietly, the words coming out before he could stop them. "I had 2 boys once, lost them both before they were grown. And when I looked at you, starving and scared, I couldn't let that happen again. Not if I could stop it." Finn's eyes filled with tears, but he blinked them away and nodded. They sat together in companionable silence, watching the stars wheel overhead, 2 survivors bound together by a choice that had changed everything. Below deck, the crew slept soundly for the first time in weeks, their bellies full, their nightmares temporarily held at bay. The ship cut through the water with renewed purpose, carrying them all toward whatever future awaited them in Charleston, toward questions they couldn't answer, stories they would spend the rest of their lives trying to understand, and a legend that would outlive them all. But for now, in this moment, they were simply alive. And that was enough. Charleston Harbor appeared through the morning mist like a memory returning to a dying man. Familiar, impossible, almost too beautiful to be real. The docks were crowded with ships of every size and shape, their masts creating a forest of wood and canvas against the pale sky. Merchants shouted prices for cotton and tobacco, sailors sang work songs as they loaded cargo, and the air smelled of salt and fish and the particular human chaos that only a thriving port city could produce. To the crew of the Morning Tide, who had spent weeks in silence and starvation, it was overwhelming. A symphony of life played at full volume after an eternity of quiet. As they guided the battered ship into dock, a crowd began to gather. Word had spread quickly through the harbor that the Morning Tide had returned, a ship that had been missing for 2 months, presumed lost in the storm that had claimed a dozen other vessels. Families rushed to the waterfront, wives searching desperately for husbands' faces, mothers calling out their sons' names, children standing on tiptoe trying to see over the adults pressed against the wooden pilings. Elias stood at the helm and watched the scene unfold with a mixture of relief and dread. He knew what was coming. The questions, the disbelief, the way people would look at him when he tried to explain what had happened out there in the fog, if he tried to explain at all. Some stories were too strange to tell, too impossible to be believed by anyone who hadn't lived them. And yet he knew, with absolute certainty, that this story would be told whether he wanted it to be or not. The crew disembarked slowly, their legs unsteady on solid ground, their bodies still adjusting to the reality of survival. They were met with embraces and tears, with prayers of thanksgiving and cries of joy. Rowan was swept into the arms of a red-haired woman who Elias knew was his sister, the only family the Irishman had left. Other men found wives, sweethearts, children who had grown taller in their absence. And Finn, young Finn, who had no family waiting for him, stood alone at the edge of the dock, watching the reunions with eyes that held both happiness and loneliness in equal measure. Elias made his way over to the boy and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You have somewhere to go?" he asked. Finn shook his head. "Boarding house on King Street, if they'll still have me. I owe them 3 months' rent." Elias reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather purse, the last of his personal savings, coins he had been keeping for an emergency that no longer seemed to matter. He pressed it into Finn's hands before the boy could protest. "That should cover your rent and then some," Elias said. "And if you need work, come find me. I'll be around." Finn stared at the purse, then at the captain, his eyes wide. "Sir, I can't." "You can," Elias interrupted gently. "And you will. Consider it payment for good service. You earned it." The boy's face crumpled, and for a moment Elias thought he might cry, but Finn straightened his shoulders and extended his hand. They shook, captain and cabin boy, survivor and survivor, and then Finn nodded once and disappeared into the crowd, clutching the purse against his chest like it contained not just money but hope itself. Over the following days, the story of the Morning Tide spread through Charleston like wildfire, growing more elaborate with each retelling. The crew tried to stay quiet at first, but sailors were sailors, and after enough rum and enough prompting, the truth, or something close to it, began to spill out. They spoke of starvation and desperation, of a captain who gave his last meal to a dying boy, of a dawn that brought not death but deliverance in the form of 200 ghost ships rising from the fog to salute a single act of mercy. Some listeners scoffed and called it tavern talk, the kind of superstitious nonsense that sailors invented to explain away good luck or bad navigation. But others listened with serious faces and knowing eyes, old sailors who had spent lifetimes on the water and understood that the ocean kept its own rules, rewarded its own virtues, punished its own sins in ways that had nothing to do with the laws of men or the logic of civilization. Elias tried to avoid the attention. He spent his days settling accounts with the ship's owners, arranging repairs for the Morning Tide, meeting with families of crew members who wanted to hear firsthand that their loved ones had survived. He didn't speak about the ghost ships unless directly asked, and even then he kept his answers brief and non-committal. What could he say that would make sense? That the dead had honored him for being less of a monster than he had been his entire life? That one moment of decency had somehow balanced decades of violence and greed? It felt wrong to claim credit for something he barely understood himself. But the story wouldn't die. It grew larger, more mythical, transforming from an account of survival into a legend about redemption. Ministers preached sermons about Captain Thorn's mercy, using him as an example of Christian charity in the face of death. Mothers told their children about the pirate who chose kindness over survival and was rewarded by heaven itself. Artists painted imagined scenes of the ghost fleet, their canvases filled with spectral ships and divine light, images that bore little resemblance to what Elias actually remembered, but captured something essential nonetheless: the idea that goodness mattered, even in the darkest places, even when no one was watching. 3 weeks after they made port, Elias received a visitor at the room he was renting above a chandlery on East Bay Street. It was Finn, but the boy looked different, cleaner, healthier, dressed in new clothes that actually fit. His face had filled out, and there was a confidence in his posture that hadn't been there before. "Captain," Finn said, removing his cap respectfully, "I wanted to thank you again. For everything. The money helped me get back on my feet, and I found work at the shipyard. Good work, with decent pay." Elias smiled. "I'm glad to hear it. You deserve good things, Finn." The boy hesitated, then reached into his coat and pulled out something wrapped in oilcloth. He set it carefully on the table between them and unwrapped it with reverent hands. Inside was the piece of biscuit he had saved, now hard as stone, preserved like a sacred relic. "I want you to keep this," Finn said quietly. "I know it sounds foolish, but it means something. What you did that day, giving me this when you could have eaten it yourself, it changed me. Made me believe that people can be good even when everything's falling apart. And I think it changed more than just me. Those ships, Captain, they came because of this. Because of you." Elias looked at the biscuit fragment, at this small, insignificant piece of hardtack that had somehow become the fulcrum upon which fate had turned, and he felt the weight of it. Not the physical weight, but the metaphorical burden of being remembered not for all the terrible things he had done, but for one good thing he had done without thinking, without calculation, without expectation of reward. "Keep it," Elias said, pushing it gently back toward Finn. "It's yours. You're the one who lived because of it. Let it remind you that your life matters, that you were worth saving, and that whatever you do with the years you've been given, they're a gift." Finn's eyes glistened, but he nodded and carefully rewrapped the biscuit, tucking it back into his coat. They talked for a while longer, about the ship, about the crew, about the strange and wonderful fact that they were both still alive. And then Finn left, disappearing back into the bustling life of Charleston, carrying his relic in his memory and his second chance. Elias never sailed again. He retired from the sea, bought a small house on the edge of the city, and spent his remaining years in quiet obscurity, tending a garden and watching the ships come and go from the harbor. He died 7 years later in his sleep, with no fanfare and no drama, just a peaceful ending to a life that had been anything but peaceful. But the legend of Captain Elias Thorn lived on. Sailors told his story in ports from Boston to Barbados, always in hushed tones, always with respect. They said that no storm ever touched the morning tide after that day, that she sailed under protection until she was finally retired and broken down for timber. They said that sailors who showed mercy at sea, who shared their food, who helped stranded ships, who chose compassion over profit, sometimes saw a lone vessel on the horizon at dawn, flying no flag, crewed by shadows, dipping its bow in silent acknowledgement before vanishing into the mist. And they said that if you ever found yourself starving and desperate, with only one piece of food between you and death, you should remember Captain Thorn and the 200 ghost ships, and you should give that food to someone who needed it more, because the ocean was watching. The dead were watching, and mercy, in the end, was the only currency that mattered when you stood at the edge of forever and asked to be remembered not for what you took, but for what you gave. Years later, long after Elias had passed into legend himself, an old sailor in a Charleston tavern would raise his glass and speak the words that had become tradition among those who knew the story. To Captain Thorn, who shared his last biscuit and earned the respect of the dead. May we all be so worthy when our time comes. And every sailor in that tavern, young and old, believer and skeptic, would raise their glasses in return and drink to a man who proved that even the darkest soul could be redeemed by a single act of light, and that sometimes, just sometimes, the universe noticed. The ocean remembered, and so did they.